whenever I'm talking about Jung, I always find myself saying, one of Jung's biggest ideas was, but then I say that about 20 different things. But I think if I had to boil it down to one word, it would be meaning.
Hello and welcome to Spokes. I'm here in Ireland during the COVID lockdown. It's 2:00 on a sunny afternoon. In this episode, I'm talking to writer and Jungian analyst Lisa Marchiano. She's in Philadelphia, where it's 7:00 in the morning. As well as being a writer and Jungian analyst, Lisa is a host of two podcasts, This Jungian Life and Secrets of the Mother World. This episode is an introduction to the ideas of the psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung. We'll be covering topics such as the shadow, projection, persona, complexes, synchronicity, fairy tales, and womanhood. We hope that you enjoy the episode, and as you're listening, check out in the middle of the discussion on dreams, something just randomly falls to the floor. So I'll point it out when it happens, and to me, I think it's a kind of a Jungian thing. So you're very welcome to Spokes, Lisa, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'd love to start with your own background and your own introduction to Jung. Like, when did you first come across his writings or his teachings, and what was it about it or what he said that attracted you, or did it initially even?
I'm so glad you asked that question because I love answering that question. My mother was actually really interested in Jung. And when I was a little girl, I would go off to school and she would sit home and read the collected works. In fact, I obviously own all of the collected works, and many of the volumes on my bookshelf are her copies with her notes in the margin. So that's kind of cool. I remember her telling me some stories that I now know are from memories, dreams, and reflections. Jung had these kind of paranormal experiences that some of which were very dramatic. And I can remember being, maybe 10 or something, and my mom telling me these incredible stories about the bell ringing, and there was no one there ringing it, but they could see it and hear it clanging in the entryway. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting, But that was about it. I knew that this was important to her. I think that her way of looking at the world was really influenced by Jung, and that influenced me. So I remember being afraid of ghosts when I was a little girl, and my mom would encourage me to ask the ghosts what they wanted, So I now understand that was very Jungian. But other than that, I wasn't exposed. And in fact, I think I sort of avoided it. I think when I was in, 14 or something, they made us take a test in school, to sort of see what career you might be good for. And I got psychologist, and I was like, I'm never going to do that. So I was sort of like, well, that's my mom's thing, so I can't do that, kind of. And then when I was 28, and I was going through a really, really hard time, and I was living in Manhattan. I was in graduate school. I was getting a master's in international affairs, and I was really, it was, I don't want to say I was depressed, but it was sort of a dark night of the soul experience for me that year. I was suffering, that's for sure. And there was this little independent bookstore kind of across Columbus Avenue that I used to just happen into. And I would always go down to the psychology section, even though I was studying international affairs. And there was this book on the shelf called On the Way to the Wedding by Linda Leonard. And The title always drew me. So repeatedly, I would take the book off the shelf. I would open it to any page. I would start reading and I would immediately tear up. And I would think, I should buy this book. But then I would think, oh, I've got 600 pages of reading about, international human rights. Like I can't buy this book. So I'd put it back on the shelf. That must have done that half a dozen times over the course of several months. And then finally, one day, I was at a particularly low ebb. And I was really just kind of struggling that day. And toward the end of the afternoon, I wound up in the bookstore again. I went down to the psychology section. I pulled that book off the shelf. I opened it to any page. I started crying. I put it back on the shelf. Then on my way home, I passed this little new age gift shop, with like the kind of store with like crystals hanging in the window. And they had, incense and dream catchers and crystals and just kind of stuff like that. At the very back of the store, they had maybe a dozen books. And On the Way to the Wedding was one of them. So even then, I was, aware enough that this was a little bit of a synchronicity and that I should buy that book. So I bought the book and I brought it back to my apartment and realized it was a signed copy. It was signed by the author. And Linda Leonard is a Jungian analyst. I've subsequently had the good fortune to meet her and get to know her a little bit. Well, I started reading that book and it was immediately balm and also a world opening up. And it was beautiful and it was true. And it was like suddenly, you'd been in a foreign land for years and years, and then you hear someone speaking your mother tongue. It was like that. I was like, by the end of that book, I was like, first of all, I had a dramatically different relationship with this difficulty that I was having. And I was like, God, I wonder if I want to be a Jungian analyst. So that book really set me on the path. I guess the rest of my story is I had this idea after I finished that book. Oh, maybe I'll want to do that. So let's see. So I was 28 when I had the idea to become an analyst, and I was 45 when I finished analytic training.
Wow. Right. So
yeah.
It really was something that was burning inside you, I imagine, then. That, you wanted to do this. This was your path.
Yeah. Some people say, like, should I become an analyst? And I always say, you should only do it if you can't not.
So it was like that for you, was it?
Yeah, it really was like that for me. It really was.
Wow.
And I should say, in between, from 28 to 45, I also, did a few other things, like had kids and a few things like that. So it's not like it was pedal to the metal the whole time.
Right. And now that you are a Jungian analyst, was it worth it?
Oh, it was. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. It's been great in every way. Jung felt that a lot of suffering was because we don't have a sense of meaning. And he thought that having a sense of meaning was really vital to a person's life. And he assumed there was meaning, and he was always looking for meaning. So, and that sounds like a very big idea, but it has important ramifications even for just your everyday life. Because, for example, I was really, really struggling when I was 28, essentially with a broken heart. And I was suffering this, and reading Linda Leonard's book helped me see the meaning in my experience. That's why it immediately shifted my relationship with that hardship. It didn't get rid of it, but I had a different relationship with it because I could see the meaning in it. And so with a Jungian lens, You're essentially always looking for meaning because you know there is some somewhere. And that reframes your whole relationship with life, with the universe. And it kind of makes it puts the magic back in.
Right. I have a list of things that I want to talk to you about. I don't know how many we're going to get through, but soul is in there. So maybe just, can you tell us a little bit about what is meant by the idea of soul?
Well, let's see. What would Jung say about soul? Maybe I'll just kind of talk about it how I understand it, which is perhaps not exactly what Jung would say, and certainly not what a theologian would say, but that there's some part of us that, that there's, maybe it's related to this idea of Jung's of the self with a capital S. The self is kind of the guiding center of the personality. It's much larger than the conscious personality. And it has a sense of being connected deeply into the collective unconscious. So kind of tapping into a deep strata of being. Jung once said it could be called the God within. And there's some sense that soul is wrapped up in that concept as well, in that it's unique to each of us, but it has something of the transcendent in it. It's not just, the conscious personality. It taps into something greater.
Right. And when you were talking about giving life meaning, the meaning is connected to the idea of the soul in some sense, isn't it? Am I right in thinking that?
I think so. I mean, I think that, it makes me think of the story of in Plato's Republic of the myth of where what Plato says is that each one of us has a daimon before we were born that kind of knows what we're supposed to live out in our life, and we forget it when we cross the threshold into life, but our daimon remembers. So the daimon becomes the carrier of destiny. So it's something like that. It's something like I do, as far as I can tell, I think this is true, that each of us does come into the world with a pattern we're supposed to live out. We're supposed to be something, or something's supposed to come into the world through us. And a lot of us experience distress when we can't align with that or figure out what it is or what needs to happen. But the soul has some sense of that, of wanting to find that, of some recollection. Oh yeah, we were supposed to do this.
And that part is within the self, like it's part of the self. So that answer is within each person, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell.
Well, that kind of ties in a little bit with another thing that I did want to talk to you about, was the importance of dreams. Tell us about dreams and Jungian analysis.
Well, working with dreams can be a big part of a Jungian analysis. There's certainly people who come into analysis who don't dream, and you can certainly have analysis without dreaming. But, Jung was one of the great thinkers in terms of dreams. And I think most clinical dream work these days is probably based more or less on kind of Jungian principles. But, okay, so if we hold in mind this idea of the self, that there is this part of us, sometimes it's referred to as the guiding self, although that's a little bit misleading because it's not like there's this kind of voice in there saying, oh, you should do this next or you should do that next. But I would say that the self contains this idea of telos, that we're evolving in a certain direction, that we're supposed to go somewhere. And the self kind of knows generally where that is we need to go. So dreams then come to us from the unconscious. They always tell us something we don't consciously know. And we can see that they're kind of like a dialogue with the unconscious. Jung was careful to say that the unconscious isn't infallible. It's not like the unconscious has all of the answers and knows everything we're supposed to do, and all we have to do is turn off the conscious mind, shut out the ego, and just listen to the unconscious. Not at all. Not at all. The unconscious knows more than consciousness, and it knows something different. But it's really up to the conscious personality to kind of meet that information and then decide what to do with it. But one of the ways that we get that information is through dreams.
Did you hear that? That's the sound of the thing that just randomly fell in the room. It's actually a Thin Lizzy album, a vinyl record that Terry loves, and he keeps it balanced on the top of the door frame to display it. I've never seen it fall before. Anyway, I've interrupted. We'll reverse a few words and keep going.
But one of the ways that we get that information is through dreams. And dreams can be kind of like a conversation with the unconscious. And I think you particularly see that if you're writing your dreams down a lot, or if you're doing a lot of dream work and analysis, where you kind of develop this particular language. Like, let's see, I for a while I had a lot of dreams that I was in an airport, and it's sort of like, once I kind of figured out maybe what that meant, the dream maker in me would sort of use the airport metaphor whenever it fit. It became like our private language. And I see this with people that I work with in analysis, where it's like, oh, there's the kitten again, whatever the kitten means. And it's like, that's our shorthand. It's almost like our shorthand for something that myself, my analysand, and my analysand's dream maker were all using the same language. So dreams are a resource. And talk about magic. I mean, if you think about it, they're a nightly experience of encountering an inner other that wants to share something with us. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by dreams, but I think an important thing, if I'm right in saying this, in Jungian analysis, I'm saying that word wrong, in Jungian analysis, is that, the way sometimes you can pick up a book, oh, what does this dream mean? What does this, in Jungian analysis, the symbol is kind of unique to the person. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes. Right. So kind of cookbook dream interpretations don't really have a place per se. Symbols are always sort of the very best way to express something that isn't quite expressible, first of all. So to reduce it, like, I dream of losing my teeth means X. That's very reductive. And we don't want to do that, because dreams have just multiple meanings, just layer upon layer of meaning. We want to try to keep that alive. We also can't really know what a dream means unless we have the dreamer there, because the dreamer is the expert on the dream. And, if you dream about taking a trip to Africa, for example, my version of taking a trip to Africa might have a very different meaning from someone who lived in Africa as a child and now lives in Europe. So if I dream of going to Africa and that person dreams of going to Africa, it's very, very different. So we really want to know the individual associations, the personal associations. Dreams sometimes are incredibly specific with the images that they choose. So they might not choose just a table. They might choose the table that we used to eat at when I was a child. And that's important. That specificity is really important. So to get that level of detail in the association matters. What I will say is that some images in dreams that don't have particular personal associations might be referring to what we sometimes call as a dominant. So, for example, a lot of people will sometimes dream of police in their dreams. And unless they have a particular association with that policeman, or maybe their father was a cop or something like that, who were the police? They keep order. They they hold up what's right. So that might refer to a function in the psyche that is policing something or interested in keeping order. So sometimes there's a place for those more collective understandings of images, but I would say we always approach that tentatively, rather than saying, oh, well, there's a policeman. That must be an image of order, We might just hazard a guess in that direction.
I'm going to go to my list now, because one of the things that I am particularly fascinated by is, and I think many people are, is this idea of shadow, the shadow side. So could you tell us a little bit about the shadow?
Yeah, the shadow was one of Jung's big ideas, but it is a really important one. And it's also, I think, in a way, it's an easy one to understand. So what Jung said is that in the course of ego development, so when we're kids, we're in school, our parents, we're constantly being taught that some things are okay and some things are not okay. And this is normal and healthy, by the way. It's not like this is a bad thing. Those parts of ourselves that we were taught are not okay go into the shadow. So, sexuality, greed, anger, destructiveness, just the kinds of things that you would get punished for if you were a kid, or shamed for, or told were wrong, they become part of your shadow. But in addition to these things that, might need to be carefully regulated, for example, like, lying or manipulating, we're all capable of that. Other things get stuffed into the shadow that maybe are more neutral, but just our parents didn't like them, or our culture tells us it's not okay. So, for example, let's say that you're very high-spirited, but you have a very kind of buttoned up family. So whenever you got loud or goofy or silly, you were really that was really sat on really hard, and maybe you were made to feel ashamed of it. So then that kind of high-spirited ruckus aspect of your personality would be in the shadow. And what might happen later on is that you might find that when you came in contact with someone who was very high-spirited and comfortable with being high-spirited, they would really annoy you. And you would feel a lot of heat around that. So one way to figure out what's in your shadow is to ask yourself, what do you get really, really annoyed by? Who really annoys you?
Ooh.
What? Yeah.
That's a difficult one, isn't it?
It is. It gets uncomfortable pretty quickly. And where is that something that exists in you that you haven't allowed yourself to claim? Jim Hollis, Jungian analyst, also always says, if you want to know what your shadow is, ask your spouse.
Okay, very good.
But why does this matter? Why does shadow work matter? Well, for many reasons, one of which is that the stuff that gets relegated to the shadow in early life can be a source of renewal in later life. So to take my example of someone who's very high spirited and likes to have a lot of fun and be spontaneous and loud and funny. If that person didn't develop that aspect of herself because it wasn't allowed in her family of origin, she might get back in touch with it maybe in her 40s and decide to do stand-up comedy nights or something. And it could be just a wonderful source of new energy for her, something like that. So that's one of the ways that shadow work is important.
Right. And that kind of leads into the idea a little bit of projection then, because you mentioned about the things that really annoy us are often the things that we don't see or don't want to see or don't want to allow in ourselves. So, but am I right then in thinking projection? I'd love you to talk a little bit about projection, but also that we project not just the shadow, but also, we can really look up to a person or think they're amazing. Isn't that an element of projection
Absolutely.
as well?
Falling in love. There's a lot of projection and falling in love.
Tell us about that.
So the Jungian take on projection is that it is completely normal. There's nothing pathological about it, and we all do it. And in fact, it's how we first meet unconscious parts of ourselves, that we project them onto other people, and we can project shadow onto other people. So we the very worst parts of ourselves, we project that out onto someone and then really hate them, and then we don't have to admit that it's part of us. But we also project the very best parts of ourselves on other people, people that we look up to, that we admire. When we fall in love, we're always projecting the most tender, valuable parts of ourselves onto the beloved. And projection becomes a problem if we aren't psychologically curious about what's going on, and we allow it to kind of get reified so that we see the other person out there as the bad guy. And that's how we've dealt with shadow. We've just projected it out there, and now we're going to go never talk to that person again, or we're going to block them on Twitter, or we're going to go annihilate them, which of course is, if you think about this sort of historically on a cultural level, this is what societies do, right? That they're the bad guy. That's the evil empire, whatever that happens to be, and we're gonna go annihilate them. So obviously, this can be very dangerous, especially in a post-nuclear world. And there are analysts who've written about that. Erich Neumann was a cohort of Jung's, and he was a Jungian analyst. He wrote a really powerful book called Depth Psychology and a New Ethic, in which he talks essentially about this, that we can no longer deal with the shadow through a projection. It's just too dangerous now. So what we want to do instead is, when we become aware we've projected something, we just want to get curious about it, and we want to come into relationship with it. And projecting it can be a first step toward doing that. But we have to be more psychological about it than just assuming it's literally true.
But surely there's some people who are all good, right?
Absolutely
I know
not.
people who are. Oh, really?
No.
No. Yeah, tell us about that then. Because I know people who want everybody to be nice and who want everybody to be good and kind all the time, and who kind of project this image, I suppose, of themselves as being, I mean, I've done it. I do it. Like, that's me not projecting. But yeah, just tell us, is there such a thing then as a person who is just good? That's it.
No. No. No, we're all capable. It's like what is that quote? Anything human, that is I. I mean, we all have within us, an inner Hitler, and we do, and we better know that. Otherwise, we can get into deep trouble. One of the things I think you were hinting at there is this idea of persona. So persona is another Jungian concept. that comes from this idea of the mask. And again, having a persona is not bad. We all need a persona. We need a business persona. We need a, family holiday with the in-laws persona. We need a babysitting the nieces persona. We have different kind of masks, if you want, that we wear. In dreams, clothing can often relate to persona, and I like the idea of clothing standing in for persona because I think that's just right. I mean, if you were going to go to a fancy cocktail party with your husband's boss, you would put on a certain outfit, and that would be like putting on a certain persona. And you would go to that party, and you would try to engage in polite chit chat, and you wouldn't talk about anything too heavy, and you wouldn't, spill your guts about the fight that you got in with your sister last week. You would try to have an appropriate cocktail party on your best behavior appearance, both socially and also physically. Whereas if you were going to go, play soccer with your girlfriends, you'd wear something different, and your personality would be a little bit different than it would at that fancy cocktail party. So there's this way that we kind of naturally wear different aspects of ourselves, and that's appropriate. And I'm going to get back to shadow in just a second. The only problem with the persona is when we're too strongly identified with it and we really think that's who we are. Okay, now the thing about the persona is that the persona is compensated by the shadow. So the brighter the persona, the darker the shadow. So those people who are all nice all the time and insist that everyone else be nice and see the world in this really kind of rigidly sunny fashion, I can bet you that they have some dark stuff in their shadow, because that's just kind of a universal law of the psyche, is that things balance.
Mm. And then, of course, is it that if you don't see that in yourself, that you see that in other people then?
Yeah, if you're not aware of your shadow, that you would project it onto someone else. Yeah. Yes.
It's so fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to talk to you as well about the idea of the complex.
Mm-hmm.
So is that the idea of an intense emotional experience where we almost get carried away by the emotion? But can you tell us a little bit about that, and what a person should do if they find themselves, in a really intense emotional situation?
Okay. So the complex was another one of Jung's really big ideas. He came up with the idea of complex when he was doing the word association test. If you saw the film A Most Dangerous Method, they show the association test in that film where Jung would read a stimulus word, and it might be something fairly neutral like table. And then the subject is supposed to answer back with the first word that comes into mind. So you might say chair. And there's a list of, I think it was like 40 words or something. And what Jung found is that there were sometimes like undisturbed responses, like I would say table and you would say chair. But there could also be disturbed responses where it would take someone a really long time to answer, or they would come up with a very nonsensical answer, or they might laugh, or have a physiological reaction. And Jung would sort of read these stimulus words and then see which words had a kind of complex reaction to it. And he could sort of intuit from that where the kind of psychic disturbances were. So complex is a web of feeling-toned associations that form around an archetypal core. And what that means is that if we have, for example, a wounding experiences with our father as a kid, let's say our father's a difficult person. And so we have some difficult experiences with him as a kid. He's disapproving, or he's stern, or he's critical, or something like that. And we feel, shame and hurt. So those are these experience that start to kind of coalesce around this idea of father. And then we might say, as an adult, that we have a negative father complex. And that might look like whenever we are in a situation with a kind of analog for father, that we have difficulty. Like, for example, this person that I'm making up who had a difficult relationship with her father, let's say that she gets to university and, her faculty advisor is this kind of stern, elderly male professor. And she finds that she just gets so anxious whenever she has to go see him that she just always is, can't get herself sorted and is kind of, scared of him. And so he thinks, what's this girl's problem, and doesn't like her. And then she has this problem with her male professor, right? And I would say that as like, there's your negative father complex kind of getting acted out into the world. And, maybe she has problems occasionally with male bosses in the future. And then when she starts to date, maybe she winds up dating men who are kind of critical and cold and that sort of thing. So we would say there's this complex that's kind of running in the background, and it's having an influence in many different areas of your life. Now, there's also what you were talking about, which is when a complex kind of becomes activated. And that's like where you have a big emotional reaction to something that maybe seems even disproportionate. And you feel, I almost think about it as like you just get unhorsed. You were riding along, you were doing fine, and then all of a sudden you just get knocked off your horse. You're sitting there on your ass going, oh my God, what just happened to me? Maybe you feel overwhelmed with fear, or you feel overwhelmed with shame or with anger, but it feels really out of control. It feels like your ego is not quite in control. And I think that you asked what we can do about that. I think that when we recognize that we're in a complex, we know that we're not seeing the world totally clearly. We're seeing it through the lens of this intense emotion that also has these kind of memories around it. So again, to kind of put this into my made up example here, this young woman, let's say that she has a bad encounter with her faculty advisor, and then she leaves and she's just distraught. She's just so distraught. And it's disproportionate to what actually just happened. But it's bringing back all this stuff about her father and not feeling good enough and feeling criticized. I'm really just making this up. And she just kind of almost can't get out of bed for 2 days, So the good thing is that when we begin to think about this as a complex, it immediately helps because we know it's going to end. And it's almost like when you're in that state, the best thing you can do is just be really gentle with yourself and just try to find compassion. Literally, things like exercising or taking a shower can help. But in essence, you're just trying to wait for it to pass and giving yourself permission to take care of yourself while you're waiting for it to pass.
Okay, so it's about being aware of it.
Yes. Once you become conscious of it, that immediately shifts it a little bit. And what you find is no one ever gets rid of their complexes. But what will happen is you'll get better at knowing you're in one. And that will make it easier to take care of yourself when you're in one. And you'll get out of it faster.
Yeah. Great. Hopefully, I think people will find that really helpful. I think it's a great method to use, or to just be aware more. And you mentioned the word curious actually earlier, so I think to be curious is a good one too, isn't it?
Curious is one of my favorite words.
Well, maybe now might be a nice time to go back to the idea of synchronicity. What are synchronicities?
So Jung worked on the idea of synchronicity with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, who had a relationship with Jung. And what he said is that a synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence. And he called it an acausal connecting principle. So it's when two things happen at the same time that they didn't cause each other, but the fact that they happened at the same time means that there's something kind of active in the psyche that's also being reflected in the outside world, or it brings in this idea of this kind of unus mundus, that we're all connected, we're all in a sort of unified field, if you will. And I'm just going to take an example from Jung's life. Let's see. He was in his office seeing a patient. I hope I get the details of this right. And she had had a dream about a scarab. And they were talking about this dream and the scarab when all of a sudden there was a kind of a scratching at the window, and Jung looked around and it was a beetle, which would be the sort of closest European analog of a scarab. And I think he opened the window, and then the bug came right in and he said, "Here's your scarab," And there was something meaningful about that for him and for the patient and for their process. And so, it's understood that synchronicities tend to happen to us when we're in the midst of an important psychological juncture, I would say. They certainly feel, thinking back to this word that I used earlier, they certainly feel highly magical. I mean, there's some that are just so remarkable that you can't not help be impressed by them. Of course, we're meaning-seeking creatures, and I think it's also easy to kind of find these patterns. If you're looking for them, you can sort of find them everywhere. And so kind of what's the threshold for it really being a synchronicity? I don't know. I mean, I think my seeing On the Way to the Wedding twice in the same day and the lowest ebb, and the second copy was signed by the author, I don't know, that felt like a synchronicity.
Another thing I wanted to talk to you about, which you have briefly mentioned, I think, earlier, was about fairy tales. I think you're a fan of fairy tales. Am I right in saying that? Because I know on This Jungian Life, you would often bring in a fairy tale to help us understand the story. The one I listened to the other day, which I loved, the one about authority, the three billy goats gruff. And I was thinking, how can there be meaning in this? But there was a psychological meaning. But can you tell us a little bit about fairy tales and Jung and your own kind of relationship to fairy tales?
Mm-hmm. Well, Jung was very interested, another one of his big ideas was archetypes. So archetypes are psychic universals, these images that, or ideas really that exist, across time and place in all cultures. There's this sense of kind of a numinous quality to an archetype. So we know something really important is there.
And can I ask you something about? Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you there just very, very briefly, because archetypes are one of the things that I've had difficulty with understanding. So could you give us an example maybe of an archetype to help us understand it?
Well, archetypes are, the kind of content of myths and fairy tales. So there's this universality to this imagery. And, of course, Greek myths are very different from, say, Celtic mythology. And yet you'll see some of the same themes and some of the same energies, even if they're imaged differently. There's the hero, there's the warrior, there's the witch, there's the goddess, And fairy tales also contain these archetypal images. So the idea of fairy tales is that they're universal. They're universal stories about the workings of the psyche, and they're patterns of psychological dynamics, kind of pictured in this wonderful colorful, beautiful, interesting language. And they're a little bit like dreams. And there's one of the reasons that we study fairy tales in training to become an analyst is because the better you are at interpreting fairy tales, the better you'll be at interpreting dreams. Partly because fairy tale imagery sometimes comes up in dreams, but also partly because it's not so different. It's not such a different exercise. So some of, Jung wrote some about fairy tales in the collected works. One of his closest associates, Marie-Louise von Franz, loved fairy tales, and she wrote many, many, many books about fairy tales. And I love Marie-Louise von Franz. So her stuff is great for like an introduction to a Jungian interpretation of fairy tales.
Do you have a favorite fairy tale?
I have a couple of favorite fairy tales. When I was a kid, I loved Beauty and the Beast. And I also loved, and I still love, this might be my favorite fairy tale, Vasilisa the Beautiful, which is a Russian fairy tale. So it's a kind of a Cinderella setup. Vasilisa's father, her mother dies. When her mother dies, her mother leaves her a little doll and tells her, if you're ever feeling, sad or distraught or scared, give the doll a little bread and a little beer and tell it your problems. And then her mother dies. Her father remarries, and of course there's the wicked stepmother and the wicked stepsisters. And they make Vasilisa, they make her sleep in the garret, they make her do all of the housework. They're very mean to her. Her father is always off on business somehow. And so Vasilisa is very miserable, but when she gets really sad, she'll give the doll a little bread and a little beer and tell it her problems, and the doll will come alive. And the doll will always say, "Go to sleep now, Vasilisa, for the morning is wiser than the evening." And then the doll will do her chores for her. So one day, the stepmother decides that she wants to get rid of Vasilisa. And the way she's going to do it is she's going to make Vasilisa go to the home of Baba Yaga, the great, wonderful Russian witch. So the stepmother causes all of the lights to go out in the house and says, there's no more fire. We can't do our work. We need fire. Vasilisa, you have to go to the nearest house and get fire. And of course, the nearest house belongs to Baba Yaga. So Vasilisa leaves, brings her little doll with her, and travels overnight to the home of Baba Yaga. And while she's walking at sundown, she sees a black horse with a black rider pass, and then night falls. In the morning, right before dawn, there's a white horse with a white rider who passes, and then the dawn comes up. And at noon, there's a red horse with a red rider. So she gets to Baba Yaga's. Now, Baba Yaga's hut is a little hut that's on chicken feet, and it can walk around. And it's encircled by this fence that's made up of human bones with skulls, and the eyes of the skulls glow at nighttime. Because Baba Yaga eats people, by the way. So there's all these human bones that make this fence around her yard, and then this crazy hut on chicken feet. Baba Yaga herself travels in a mortar and pestle. So she sits in the mortar and she scrapes along with the pestle. It seems like such a very inefficient mode of travel, but that's how she gets around. And so she comes along and she asks Vasilisa, "What do you want?" And Vasilisa said, I'm here to request a light. And Baba Yaga said, "Well, you'll have to serve me first, and then we'll see." So she lets Vasilisa in, and each day she gives Vasilisa more and more difficult problems, like cook me an amazing meal, clean every part of my house, separate the wheat seeds from the poppy seeds. It's just impossible things. And then she leaves for the day, and Vasilisa always, gives her doll a little bit of bread and a little bit of beer and says, I don't know what to do. The witch is going to eat me if I don't do these things. And the doll says, don't worry about it. I got it. So the doll does this for her for 3 days. And at the end, Baba Yaga is very impressed. And she asks Vasilisa if she has any questions for her. And Vasilisa is very careful not to ask too many questions. And then Baba Yaga asks her, how did you do all this? And Vasilisa very clearly says, with my mother's blessing. And so Baba Yaga says, all right, then be off with you. But before she leaves, Baba Yaga gives her one of the skulls with the lighted eyes. It says, don't forget to give this to your stepmother. So Vasilisa goes home. By the time she gets home, it's almost light out. So she's about to throw the skull away. And the skull says, don't throw me away. Take me into your stepmother. So she goes into the house with the skull. And immediately the skull burns its eyes into the stepmother and sets her and the stepsisters on fire and kills them.
Right.
And then there's a second part of the fairy tale that Vasilisa winds up marrying the Tsar. But
so to me, that's a great story. And what an amazing image of, these defense made of bones with the lights. But what's the significance of it?
Well, it turns out that it is kind of a theme and variations on an ancient story of the descent to the goddess. And one of the earliest versions of this is in the Sumerian legend of Inanna and Ereshkigal, where the kind of Aphrodite-like goddess Inanna goes to visit her sister Ereshkigal, which is, she's an underworld goddess. And when Inanna gets there, she has to strip. She has to take off all of her clothing and all of her jewelry. She arrives at her sister's naked. Her sister kills her and hangs her to rot on a meat peg. And finally, Inanna is rescued. And when she is rescued, she comes back to the upper world changed. Now she has the eyes of death, which means she can kill you by looking at you. So it's an image of a female initiation into the depths, a claiming of aggression. Vasilisa had a good mother who gave her the doll, but sometimes that good mother energy doesn't help you get in touch with your aggression. It helps you be kind and nurturing and gentle, and that's good. But you also need, as a woman, you need to find your eyes of death. And that's what Vasilisa gets when she serves the goddess. I mean, part of the significance of the horsemen, which I left out in my retelling, is the white, red, and black horsemen they are servants of Baba Yaga. And so it lets us know that she is actually a great nature goddess. She's not just a witch, she's a nature goddess. I mean, I think that's what witches are, really, are degraded nature goddesses. But she is kind of, an earth goddess. And so what has happened is Vasilisa has been to serve the goddess, the dark goddess. And she's gotten in touch with her aggression. And now she can protect herself.
Right. I mean, that's just extraordinary. Like this, I do think there's a pressure on, I do think women in particular, to be nice. And this idea of an almost saccharine sweetness that, that we're meant to have in the world. So it sounds very powerful to kind of reclaim that element. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like, don't mess with me.
Yeah. And the fact that these two themes, right, these two stories, which in essence are very similar, occurred in these different cultures at such different times. It shows you how universal, how archetypal this is, that women need to have this journey to the underworld to claim this authority. The same thing happens to Persephone. She's Kore, the maiden, who's abducted to the underworld. But after spending some time there, she becomes Persephone. And she's in Greek mythology, she's very, very powerful and feared So she becomes, a powerful goddess. But that we all have to have that journey to the underworld to claim that part of ourselves.
Do you think that that's something in contemporary societies that isn't really done enough, maybe, for women?
Well, I think that life initiates us. So I think most of us can imagine for ourselves what our journey to the underworld was. I think many of us have had that in some way.
Right. I mean, there is so much. My God, there's so much. I could keep talking about this stuff for hours. But what we might do is, if there's interest in the listener, if the listeners have interest, that we could maybe look at doing a second one, maybe down the line. We can talk
I'd
about
be
that
happy to.
another time. Great. So maybe let's finish up with talking about. Well, is there anything, first of all, that you think that we haven't covered that you think would be important and that should be mentioned?
Yeah, maybe just quickly, I'll mention this idea of individuation. This was
Great.
another one of Jung's big ideas, and I've already hinted at it. But Jung believed, again, that there's a trajectory of growth toward wholeness, not perfection, wholeness, that we're all meant to be following. And by the way, he says the right way to wholeness is full of fateful detours and wrong turnings. So this is not a linear journey. But he called this individuation, and it's the process of becoming more and more conscious of who we are. And it's a kind of lifelong quest. But it's really, one of the things about Jung is he was one of the few early theorists of personality who stressed that development goes on over the whole lifespan. It doesn't stop when we're 5 or when we're 12 or even when we're 20, but that we continue to grow and change throughout our whole lifespan. And he called that process individuation.
Right. So the process of, if somebody went to a Jungian analyst, yeah, the idea is to become individuated. Is that right? That would be the way to put it?
Although that makes it sound like there's a finish line.
Okay.
And there really isn't. There
Yeah.
really isn't. And by the way, I don't think you need to be an analysis to become individuated, but or to have that process of individuation. But analysis can help it along, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it is the process of just remaining open to life, open-hearted to ourselves, to life, to being curious, so that we just continue to learn more and more about ourselves.
Great. So one of the ways I came across you actually was on Twitter, and you also write for Quillette and for lots of other places. So is there any main topics that you do write about?
Well, I have taken an interest in what's been going on recently across many Western nations, where a lot of teens, especially teen girls, have been identifying as transgender. And I think that my Jungian background definitely caused me to be, I would say, curious about that. For a bunch of different reasons, partly because I do see the need to explore the contrasexual part of our personality as a very normal, important thing. Jung had this idea we didn't cover of the anima and the animus. He said that, that every woman has a kind of inner man. I'm going really quick here, and every man has an inner woman. But that, there are masculine elements to every woman's personality, and that it could be really important to develop those and come into relationship with them. So when I found out that teenagers were doing things like cutting off their breasts at 16, I thought, well, this is like a concretization of an important symbolic process. So that initially made me really skeptical. And then the more I looked into it, the more I felt that there was a kind of psychic epidemic afoot. And psychic epidemics are another thing that Jung wrote about. So I've written quite a bit on that topic because it's something that concerns me.
Okay, so we leave it at that, and thank you so much. That was fascinating.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Spokes was produced by Colette Colfer and Terry Hackett, with a little input from our son, Stevie. Thanks to our guest, Lisa Marchiano. If you'd like to hear more from Lisa on the subject of young, check out This Jungian Life podcast, which is available at thisjungianlife.com. Jungian with a J, Jungian.
Please like and subscribe and share the video.
There is no video.